Okay, in this video we're going to look at how to generic model. And we're going to generic model in place, which means we're going to model in a project file. So let's open up a new project file. And the reason you would want to model in place is so that you can model based off of existing building geometry. So let's go ahead and create some grid lines. I'll create a couple vertical grid lines and a couple horizontal grid lines. Okay, so we're going to use these grid lines to create a parametric relationship with our generic model. Now, when you model in the project environment, one of the problems is grid lines do not show up in a 3D view. So if I go to my 3D view, I can see that. So I want to be able to model in 3D. So what I can do if I go back to level 1 is I can create some model lines that are constrained to the grid lines and base my generic model off of those. So from the ribbon, I'll click on Model Line and I'll click on the rectangle tool, and I will constrain this rectangle to the grid lines by clicking on all 4 of the constraints. Hit escape a couple times and just test this out by selecting a grid line, changing its dimension, and making sure that the model lines move with it. Okay, so now that that's working, I can go to my 3D view and my model lines will show up. So for the first type of generic model, we're going to create an extrusion. So from the ribbon, I'll click on the down arrow for component and choose model in place. Revit wants me to categorize it, and I'll categorize it under generic models, and I'll accept the default. Now Revit wants me to tell it what type of generic model I'm going to create. Again, this is an extrusion, and I can create a rectangle and snap to my model lines and constrain this extrusion to the model lines. Click on the green check mark. Now Revit will allow you to make multiple extrusions as one model. Other types of generic models like sweeps and blends can be made all as one model. So that's why we have to click on the green check mark once again to finish the model. Okay, so the test now is if the grid lines move, will the model lines move, and then this generic model move as well. So there's 3 levels of constraints. So let's go back to level 1 and let's flex these grid lines. Okay, so that's working. And if we go to 3D view, we can see our model lines in green. If I type WF, which is the shortcut to wireframe, and just making sure that my model lines are beneath it. Okay, so let's make one more extrusion. This time I want to make a circular extrusion, and I want it to be constrained to other objects. So I'll go to level 1 and go to the Home tab, and this time I'm going to make a grid, but I'm going to make it circular. And I'll do this by choosing a grid line that looks first for the center point and then each ends of the arc. So I'll pick a center point, and then it's looking for the beginning of the arc and then the end of the arc. Now I can't create 360 degrees because every time I pass 180 it flips to the other side. So there's a way around this. I'll create the grid line, hit escape, select it and turn off the bubble. Then I'll zoom in I'll select the grid line, drag one of the ends close to 360 degrees, but not quite. Okay, so the idea is to make another extrusion that is constrained to this grid line. So from the Home tab, click on the down arrow for component, choose Model in Place, Generic Models, accept the default, select Extrusion, choose Pick Lines, and pick the circular grid line and lock it or constrain it. Click the green check mark to finish that extrusion. Click the green check mark to finish modeling. So does this extrusion follow the grid line? Well, let's check it out. So I'm going to tab to select the grid line and change the grid line's radius. And it looks like that's working. The next type of generic model we'll look at is a blend. From the Home tab, click on the down arrow for component, choose Model in Place, categorize it as a generic model, accept the default. Okay, so this is a blend which is looking for two shapes, and it will blend the surface between the two shapes. So I'll click on Blend, and I'll start with a rectangle. And I'm going to create a rectangle from the intersection of these grid lines in the lower right. So I want to constrain it to the grid lines, and I'm getting one constraint here to grid line number 2, so I'll lock that. I'll hit escape a couple times. I also need a constraint to grid line number 4. I'll type AL, the shortcut for a line, choose grid line 4, choose the edge of the shape, and lock it. Okay, so that will constrain my blend to the lower right hand corner. Now I want to be able to constrain the size of this shape. So I'll hit escape a couple times. And what I want to do is select the opposite sides and constrain those dimensions. So I'll click on this side, and we have an 8'6" dimension. I'll change that to be 4 feet in this case, and I'll change that from a temporary dimension to a permanent dimension. I'll hit escape, and I'll select that dimension, and I'll lock it. So it will keep that always at 4 feet as this slab grows or shrinks. And I'll do the same thing for this side. I'll select it, change that dimension to permanent. First, I'll change the size. Let's make this 2 feet. I'll change it to a permanent dimension. I'll hit escape. I'll select that dimension and I'll lock it. Okay, so that's the base of our blend. Now I want to create the top of our blend. So from the ribbon, I need to click on Edit Top. Now what's important here is that I draw this on another level, because when I create the top, it's going to create it on the current work plane, which is level 1. So for now, just to give it some height, I'm going to change the work plane to level 2. So I'll go up to the ribbon, I'll change it to Set, change my work plane to level 2, click OK, and now when I draw this rectangle, it's going to draw it on level 2. So using a rectangle, I'll snap to the lower right hand corner, create my rectangle, lock my constraints, hit escape, and I want to constrain the size of this rectangle like we did for the base. So let's make this 8 feet. make it permanent, select it and lock it, and do the same thing for the other side. We'll make this 6 feet, make it permanent, select it and lock it. Go to my contextual tab, click the green check mark, and click the green check mark to finish the model. Okay, let's take a look at this in a 3D view. So this blend should be parametric to the floor slab, meaning as this floor slab grows or shrinks, this blend should move with it. Let's test that out by going to level 1, selecting our grid lines, which pretty much control the whole model at this point. Let's move this grid line number 4, and that column is moving with it. And we'll do that in the other direction. So for this, let's create a couple more grid lines. I'll create a horizontal grid line and another vertical grid line. Now what I can do is I can start to use these grid lines as work planes. So let's go to a 3D view, and let's set the work plane to be grid line number 6. So I'll go up to the ribbon in the upper right and click on Set. Under Specify a Work Plane, I'll choose grid line 6, and I can click on Show to see that grid line. So everything I draw is going to be on that work plane. Now there's no way to turn off the grid and still see the work plane, but what you can do is you can select the work plane and change this work plane grid spacing to a large number like 100 feet. Click Apply. And the reason I'm doing that is I don't want to snap to those grid lines. Okay, so the next generic model we're going to look at making is a revolve. So I'll tell Revit that I want to make a revolve, and a revolve needs two things. It needs a boundary line or a shape, and that has to be a closed shape, and then it needs an axis line for that closed shape to revolve around. So let's start with the boundary line, and I'm going to go ahead and make an arc that looks for a start and an end and then creates a radius. So I'll pick my start at the top of this slab, and I'll hold my shift key and I'll create its height and then its radius. So I mentioned that this shape needs to be a closed shape. So what I'll do is I'll use my offset from the ribbon. I'll tell it a distance that I want to offset. In this case, I'll make it 6 inches. And if I zoom in, I have to be careful which side I want to offset on. So I'm going to offset to the inside, and this has to be a closed shape, so I'm going to use the line tool to go ahead and close that off. So that's going to be my shape. Next, I want my axis line. And I want to constrain that axis line to those two grid lines I just created in level 1, intersecting through this slab. I can't see these in 3D, but I can go to an elevation view. So I can go to my east elevation, and there I have my grid lines. And let's look at this from the north side so we can see the shape. Okay, so there's the shape. I'm going to turn off the work plane, and I'm going to draw my axis line. I can draw it or just pick lines and pick grid line number 7, and I can lock it. Okay, so it's locked to grid line number 7. Well, there's grid line number 6 that's visible in my east elevation. And I can use the align command this time, the shortcut AL, and pick grid line number 6. And then pick my axis line and lock it. So now it's locked to both of those grid lines. And I can click on the green check mark and click on Finish Model. So the benefit of this is, as grid line 6 moves, so does the revolve. And let's go back to our 3D view and see our revolve. And if we go back to level 1, okay, so the center of that revolve is always going to be the intersection of these grid lines. The next type of generic model that I'm going to make is a sweep. Let's go to the 3D view. Now, I'm going to sweep along the top of this slab. So I can turn off some of these objects. And what I'll do is I'll hide them temporarily so it's easier to get them back. So if I select an object and I type in HH, it hides it temporarily. I can select that column and type in HH. Now if I Control Z a couple times and bring those objects back, if I want to isolate, as I do in this case, the slab, I can select it and type the shortcut HI to isolate it. And all the other objects are temporarily hidden. To get them back, I can type in HR. Again, I'll isolate the slab, type in HI. Hit escape. Okay, so let's create the sweep. From the Home tab, click on the down arrow for Component, Model in Place, Generic Models, click OK, choose Sweep. Now, a sweep needs a path and a shape to sweep along the path. I'll start by sketching the path. Click on Sketch Path. Now I want to sketch the path on the top of this slab. So I'll need to change my work plane. Click on Set. This time pick a plane. Click OK and pick the top of the slab. Sets the work plane. I'm going to turn that work plane off. Use my rectangle tool to create the path and constrain it to the slab. Now I'm done creating the path, and I can't tell you how many times I go to create the shape while I'm still in this path mode. So after you create the path, you have to click on the green check mark, and now we have to create the shape, or what Revit calls the profile, to sweep along this path. So I'll click on Edit Profile. It's showing me my work plane for that profile. I'm going to uncheck Show. And I'm going to snap my profile or shape to the intersection of these reference lines. And I'll just choose a rectangle. Click on the green check mark. Click on the green check mark once more to finish the model. And it sweeps it along the path. Now, what if I wanted to create a sweep that had two profiles? Click on the green check mark, right click on the sweep tool, and select Sweep. Click on the green check mark once more to finish the model. And it sweeps it along the path. Now, what if I wanted to create a sweep that had two profiles? Click on the green check mark, right click on the sweep tool, and select Sweep. Well, for that, I need to use a sweep blend. So I'll go ahead and finish this model by clicking on the green check mark. And we'll look at creating a sweep blend. From the Home tab, click on the down arrow for Component, Model in Place, Generic Models, click OK, and choose Sweep Blend. We'll start with our path. I'll click on Sketch Path. And I want to draw this path now on the top of the last sweep that I made. So I'll click on Set, pick a plane, click OK, and I'll pick the top of that sweep. I can turn off the work plane. So for this path, I'm going to use a start end radius. This can be my start and my end, and this can be my radius. Okay, so now we see our two work planes, which will allow us to draw two profiles. So I'll start with my first profile. So to do that, I have to click on the green check mark because I'm done with my path. And now you see I have two profiles, 1 and 2. So I have to tell Revit which one I want to draw. Let's draw profile number 1. Now I need my draw tools. So where are they? So to bring those up, I have to click on Edit Profile. Shows me the work plane to host the profile. This time I'm going to make a center end arc, and I'm going to use the center point. So I'm going to orbit my view a bit. I'm going to use the center point of that work plane, and I'm going to create my radius and then my arc. Now this needs to be a closed shape or a closed profile, so I have to hit escape a couple times, and I'm going to use the offset, and I'll offset it a small distance. I'll use 2 inches, and I will close this off with some lines. Okay, so that's going to be my first profile. Now I'm done drawing that profile, so I have to click on the green check mark. I have to tell Revit that I'm going to draw the second profile by clicking on Select Profile 2. My draw tools are not here, so I have to click on Edit Profile. It highlights that work plane, and I can now draw on that work plane using the center end arc again. This time I'm going to make it quite a bit bigger. Needs to be a closed profile, so I'll offset it and draw my end lines. I'm done with that profile, and I'm done with the model, so I have to click on the green check mark a second time, and there is my sweep blend. And I'm done with the sweep blend, so I have to click on Finish Model. So the last thing we're going to look at is how to create a void. So to get back the rest of my geometry that's temporarily hidden, I type the shortcut HR. And let's look at putting a void in the revolve that we made. So I'll select my revolve. I'll type HI to isolate it. So if I want to put an opening so that someone could walk into this space, I need to first edit this revolve. If I create a void object, it won't cut the revolve. We'll need to select the revolve, click on Edit in Place from the ribbon, and now we'll need to create a void form as opposed to the solid forms that we just created. So I'll click on the down arrow for void form, and I'll choose void extrusion. And I want to set my work plane to be level 1. I'll click on set, change it to level 1, click OK. I can click on show just to verify that work plane is set. Let's use a rectangle for our void. And I can look at this in a top 3D view by double clicking on the word top. And I'll click my rectangle tool, and I'll make sure the rectangle goes through the revolve, and I'll click on the green check mark to finish that extrusion, and I'll hold down my shift key and my middle wheel to orbit, and I want to change the height of this extrusion. So let's look at this in a 3D front view by double clicking on the word front. I'll select that void and I'll pull it up, not all the way through, I just want to create an opening. Okay, so to actually make this void go through the revolve, I'll need to cut. So I'll click on from the ribbon, and it will ask me for the solid geometry to be cut, and I can see that in the lower left hand corner of my screen. So the solid geometry to be cut or void is going to be the revolve. And now it wants me to select the void geometry to do the cutting, which will be that void extrusion. And now we have an opening, and I can click on the green check mark for finish model. Now to turn everything else back on that's temporarily hidden, I can type in HR. So that's it for our generic models.